Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Welcome, everyone, to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Glad you joined me. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. Also, visit the PAS Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends. The 2024 presidential elections are in high gear. We got the Republican National Convention going on right now. Obviously, you have the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. And many of us think that it's all the Hitler references, the threat to democracy, that this will be the last election we ever hold. And it's that type of rhetoric that may have led to this assassination attempt. Now, I have Professor Adam Ellwanger joining us. He's been on the PAS report before. He put together a report with the Heritage Foundation, Transition Integrity Project 2024. Now, this is not to be confused with the Transition Integrity Project of 2020 that was done by a bunch of never-Trumpers and James Baker, former FBI guy that was involved in the Russian collusion hoax, and a whole bunch of others. So, Adam, welcome to the program. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me back, Nick.
Well, I'm glad you could join me because I want you to explain to the audience the intent behind creating this report, the Transition Integrity Project of 2024, and what it details out.
Well, much of your audience probably remembers the former Transition Integrity Project that you were mentioning. That integrity project was framed as a preparatory strategic response to the eventuality that Trump lost in 2020 and refused to leave office. At the time, I still think that idea was preposterous. As we know, the entire administrative state was aligned against the former president. And had he lost a clear, loss in the election, he would have been facing down every arm of the state that worked to dislodge him from the White House. And so, given that there was never any real threat that Trump clung to power, it occurred to me that the Transition Integrity Project of 2020 must have had another purpose. And I think that other purpose was to create the perception among the American public and leaders who have some control over how elections go, that the threat from Trump was so dire that any kind of malfeasance or manipulation was not only justified, but was patriotic to avoid the threat to capital O, capital D, our democracy. And so essentially the original Transition Integrity Project was a form of election interference. It was a public opinion operation. But it occurred to me that it is in fact the left now who is saying that Trump is a domestic extremist, his supporters are too, and they are hell-bent on ending this democracy in our nation. And I started thinking we tend to write that off as exaggeration. When people like you and I hear that, we're like, oh my gosh, that's hyperbole. How ridiculous. What if they mean it? And
well, Biden tells us all the time it's not hyperbole.
That's right. And we saw this weekend how deadly serious they are, right? And we have to get inside that mindset and ask ourselves, if you really believe that a Trump victory would result in the end of the United States of America, what aren't you willing to do to avoid that fate? And you come to the realization that literally everything's on the table, right? Now, the next thing that you realize is that in the event that Trump won in November, that it's totally possible that Joe Biden could say, you know what, I recognize this was a clear Trump victory, but the threat is just too great. We cannot turn over power to someone who's going to end this nation. The difference would be that the entire administrative state would work to ensure that power grab was able to be executed. And so this was the purpose of our Transition Integrity Project. Why is it named the same thing? Because, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? And the insight that the original project provided us was that the incumbent is always the greatest threat to a peaceful transition of power. And so that's the rationale for the report. We ran a series of war games, scenarios where we gamed out what would happen with different contingencies. There were about 50 different policy experts, intelligence people, former elected officials. We had former Democratic senator from New Jersey, Bob Torricelli, playing the role of Joe Biden in these scenarios. So this was a genuinely bipartisan exercise. And we just issued our report from these scenarios in DC this past week.
Now, when we look at, I did an episode on the Transition and Integrity Project 2020, and I did it at that time talking about it because not only was it designed to basically make Trump to be the extremist, but it was also designed in a way that you're not allowed to question elections, that you're not allowed to raise challenges and marginalize candidates, pigeonhole them. And I always say, I disagree slightly with the analysis from Transition Integrity Project 2024 when you say that the incumbent is the greatest threat. To me, it's the bureaucracy that's the greatest threat. And the bureaucracy has shown why they're such a threat, from the CIA spying on sitting members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, that they have 6 ways of Sunday to get back at you, that we've seen repeated abuses with the FISA requests and Americans being unmasked when they shouldn't be, Americans being spied on, threat tagging of parents, threat tagging of people that support President Trump. I'm a Catholic, and we all saw the Richmond product that targeted traditional Catholics. So you look at the bureaucracy, and one thing that I always found bizarre when they say Trump's going to be a dictator. Does anyone really believe the bureaucracy would allow Trump to become a dictator? I mean, let's just be real here. But when you did your exercises, what did you find?
Well, to your point, you're not wrong that the bureaucracy is an imminent threat to peaceful transition of power. Aligned with a president of the party that they favor, that is a force magnifier for the threat. And one of the things we found, there were many things that unfolded, but was that almost certainly intelligence agencies and the bureaucracy will put a finger on the scale. So, for example, one thing that happened was in the event of an apparent Trump victory, we saw that the people who were playing Antifa, Black Lives Matter, these sorts of groups, made reports in swing states that Trump had apparently won, that there was racial intimidation at the polls. At that point, the Merrick Garland's Justice Department and the CIA opened investigations through the Civil Rights Department and said that this possibility of interference requires that they take over the ballot counting in those swing states that apparently favored Trump. Right. We, in the scenario of the game, we were able to beat back those power grabs by the Justice Department, but that was very difficult to do. And it depended on people standing by with lawsuits ready to file and knowing how to fight that in advance. Other things that happened, in the scenario of the games, we saw the cartels manipulating and throttling the flow of illegal aliens over the border. Obviously, we'll probably see a great slowdown over the next couple of months because they prefer to keep Biden in office, and Biden's good for business, so they're not going to make a big deal. But we did see in the scenario of the exercises some Chinese nationals caught at the southern border with blueprints of water treatment facilities in Texas, which suggests a risk of infrastructure attacks. We saw a good deal of street violence, again, in reaction to apparent gains that Trump was making in the race from leftist organized groups. We really tried to game out every possible threat that's within the realistic scope of imagination and figure out how we might be able to respond to that if it arose.
Well, isn't the intelligence community already interfering with the 2024 election cycle? I was just reading an article a few weeks ago about how the intelligence community is screaming that Russia is trying to interfere in the 2024 presidential election. They're trying to manipulate and sway the American public. And I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, like, are you kidding me? Here we go again. They're at it again. It's so blatant and obvious. And when it comes to the Electoral College, there's a lot of things that people don't know about it, and I want to ask you about that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Are you prepared for the unexpected? As a former emergency manager, being prepared is not a choice, it's a necessity, and that's where the wellness company comes in. Imagine having the peace of mind that you're equipped to handle any medical crisis, from tick bites to the latest pandemic. The wellness company's medical emergency kit is your lifeline, packed with essential medications like ivermectin, emergency antibiotics, antivirals, and more. This kit is your ultimate preparedness solution. The wellness company's team of renowned medical professionals, including Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. James Thorpe, Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. Drew Pinsky, and more. They are truth-seeking doctors, and they have designed a kit that sets the gold standard for safety and prevention. Don't wait for the next crisis to strike. Visit twc.health/PAS and use promo code PAS for an exclusive 10% discount just for being a listener of this show. Prepare today, rest easy tomorrow. Use code PAS at checkout. Welcome back, everyone. So right before the break, I brought up the idea of the Electoral College, and people don't understand, but the Founding Fathers, a lot of the reason they compromised and settled on the Electoral College is because we were a new nation, and it would make it that much difficult for foreign actors to try and interfere and manipulate our election cycle. At the time, we had 13 states, so you'd have 13 different state election systems that you'd have to manipulate. Today, we have over 50 elections taking place at the same time. It's the states and D.C. with the territories. So when we're looking at it from that perspective, it makes it much more different for foreign governments to manipulate, because they would have to manipulate several election systems. Now, if we had a federal national popular vote, that makes it much easier for foreign governments to interfere in our elections, because all they have to do is manipulate one election system. So the whole intent behind the Electoral College was to protect us partly from foreign interference. And there are other reasons for the compromise, but that was a big one. But we're already seeing the American intelligence community already getting involved. We already see that the media is already starting. The rhetoric has certainly been tamped up. Now, it's been dialed back to a certain degree. Not much. I mean, you still have Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just the other day called the former president a white supremacist and neo-Nazi. So since the assassination, it's tamped down slightly, but the rhetoric is still hot. And by the time this interview airs, I'm sure we'll be back to the Hitler references. I've little doubt about that. It's fascinating to watch. I was watching MSNBC, Joy Reid, I know, God help me, but she downgraded Trump from Hitler to George Wallace, I believe it was. But getting back to the Heritage Foundation's Transition Integrity Project, did you guys happen to have political assassinations on your bingo card?
We deliberately took that off the table before we started. There were three assumptions that we just decided are too much of a wild card to figure out how they might play out. One was assassination attempts. One was Biden's rapidly declining mental acuity and how his health might play out over the coming months. And a third was the lawfare against Trump. We did see some of that in the games, but we didn't make any attempt to figure out how the existing charges against him would play out. Seems like we had one more too, but you just mentioned a moment ago when you mentioned the Electoral College, this is another threat that your audience should be aware of. If you read the Transition Integrity Project of 2020's report very closely, they said that, and this is a quote, in the event of a, quote, clear Trump win, they would refuse to acknowledge the outcome of the election, foment street violence, encourage the states of the Western coast to secede, and only recognize a Trump victory as legitimate once they had received concessions to eliminate the Electoral College, which, according to them, is an anti-democratic institution, to make DC and Puerto Rico states, and to term limit every Supreme Court judge until they're 70 years old. Now, think about that. If those wishes were granted, you've established left rule in perpetuity, right? That was the price of recognizing a Trump win for them. And so I think if we see a Trump win in November, I very much expect that there will be calls to just say, sorry, we just can't do the Electoral College anymore.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. And listen, Democrats despise the Electoral College, and I get it. They were burned twice by it in the
Yep.
last friggin' 20 years. So they're not going to be fans of it. If the shoes were reversed, Republicans would hate it, and Democrats would be like, oh, the Electoral College, phenomenal. But the reality is that the Electoral College needs to stay in place because we are not a democracy. We are a republic, and a republic operates much differently than a democracy. Now, what were your conclusions from the report? You mentioned a few minutes ago the ways to overcome some of the games that may be played. So, what were some of the ways to overcome the games that were going to be played?
Well, at the end of the report, and I'd encourage everybody to view it. You can view it at transitionintegrityproject.org.
And we'll
That'll
have
give
links
you.
up at the PAS report for that.
Oh, great. We have a PDF there. The report's about 70 pages. You can see some media that was produced in game. We had actual people who work for the media reporting on the in-game events. So, and then we would blast those media reports out to participants. So it gave a very real feel that they were trying to read the situation in real time. The report ends, though, with 20 recommendations, right? 20 ways that people can prepare. And average people need to be prepared. One of the things I think that we need to be more ready to do, and this is a dangerous thing to say because our opponents will say, oh, January 6th, right? But a visible presence in the streets, a large presence in the streets in the event of a contested election is an important visual symbol to motivate the courts to adjudicate these things. Because last time the court said, we're not getting into this, right?
They didn't want to go anywhere near it.
That's right. And we need to bring some force to bear if things look like they did in 2020 to get the, and that has to happen earlier. It can't happen at certification, and obviously it's got to be nonviolent, right? But we need to sort of take some cues from our friends on the left, our friends on the left, and to get better at organizing a visual public presence, a physical presence in response to these kinds of abuses. Another thing ordinary people can do, and this is critical, is train to be poll workers, observe at the polls, right? Stay around, obviously bring your phone everywhere, right? But it's going to be critically important that when we witness abnormalities, that we are able to document them. Because part of the problem with the cases in 2020 was that we were filing those cases to try to demonstrate fraud, right? And they were saying, no, we're not going to go through legal process to let you fish it out, right? We need to have the evidence in the front end, right? So that the courts have we have undeniable standing to claim redress. So there's a ton of recommendations there for people in positions of public power, for law enforcement. One thing that I would recommend to any governor, especially red state governors, is to make clear in no uncertain terms at this point that any violent demonstrations will be prosecuted by local law enforcement to the fullest extent of the law, right? That the governors need to convey that is their expectation to sheriffs and law enforcement, so that heads will roll if what we see again is a bunch of book and release and standing down while they burn police departments and everything else. So really, like, these 20 recommendations touch on all different areas of American life and how we can prepare to ensure a free, fair, and legal, this time, election.
Now, I think that the assassination attempt has had a profound impact on this race, right? I mean, prior to the assassination attempt, Joe Biden was already in trouble because of the cognitive decline, his debate performance, people were questioning him, and Democrats were starting to challenge him. Now that's actually ebbed a little bit because you see Democrats that they're demoralized. It's a little weird that you're demoralized that, president didn't get executed. But in any event, they seem demoralized. And there are reports that some Democrats are resigned, that they're not going to win the 2024 election, that it's going to be Trump's momentum is too much and Biden's cognitive decline is only going to get worse. So let Biden stay on the ticket, because then when we lose, we're just going to blame him, that he was old and he was stubborn and he didn't want to get off the ticket. But do you think, because your report was done prior to the assassination attempt. Do you think that the assassination attempt changed the dynamic where Democrats may be forced to accept the results of the election because of the movement, the shifts that we're seeing in the numbers?
Um, I'll say this. I think that the probability of a Trump win just went up. Uh, and this is very sad to say, obviously, but again, if they really believe what they say, and I think many do, it's not unlikely that we could see another event like we did on Saturday before this is over. So that's there. I think, yes, if there was still decency in the Democratic Party, then maybe now this is sort of an insurmountable lead where they just have to say, yep, we lost. Joe was the wrong guy. But I don't think we can afford the luxury of making that assumption. I think that they've given us manifold evidence that they see this as an existential election, right? That this is the final boss, and they either win this or it's over. And if that's the case, if that's really the way that they see it, then I don't think that they're going to go easily, even in the most profound Trump victory.
Adam, now we're witnessing Republicans riding a wave of momentum, but Republicans do have a problem, and I want to talk to you about that problem when we get back from this quick break. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So, Adam, one of the big problems that Republicans have is that they haven't won the popular vote in quite some time. I believe it's either 32, maybe even 36 years. And that's a long time not to win the popular vote, and that does represent a problem for the Republican Party as a whole. Now, there's a lot of momentum behind Republicans. There's no doubt about that. You can't dispute that. And if you win the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, it makes it that much more difficult for anyone to dispute the election results. So did the Transition Integrity Project war game out that scenario? And in that scenario, if you did it, did the Democrats stand down, or were they like, okay, let's get out there and mobilize?
There was one scenario where at the end of the election, and we gamed it from the conventions to the inauguration. So at the point in the game where the election had ended, Trump had over 270, I think. But if I recall, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona were still undecided. And so he had won the popular vote. He had enough to win the Electoral College, but there were 3 states outstanding. And if Biden could flip all of them, if Biden could win out the states that were still being counted, then it would be something like 271 to 268 in the Electoral College, with Trump having the advantage. So Democrats fighting the counts in those 3 states then went to the state of Virginia because they recognized even if they won those 3, they wouldn't have enough to overtake Trump. But Trump's victory in Virginia was only about 7,000 votes. And so they set to legal action there too to try to flip that. And if they could run the table, if they could flip Virginia and win out in all of the 3 uncalled states, then they would win the presidency. Ultimately, they did not succeed in doing that. I think Trump won all 3 of those outstanding states, and then they gave up their lawsuits in Virginia because what's the point? But then we did have a significant waves of street violence and organized attempts to ensure that the procedural mechanisms that would install Trump as the 47th president could not occur. Of course,
well, just look at France. The left loses, they riot. The left wins, they riot. It's like, it doesn't matter. And I think you bring up a good point. We can't figure out elections on election night, and that's a big part of the problem. That, it amazes me with all this technology of today. Everything was, it's going to be easier, it's going to tally quicker, and all this. And now it takes several weeks. And the more time it takes to figure out who won a state, that's the more time that both sides are going to engage in some type of conspiracies, saying that there's shenanigans going on. the fact that we can't determine elections on election night is absolutely pathetic. And did your report find that that's a big part of the problem?
Yep, absolutely. That's one of our 20 recommendations. At the end of it is I'm a rhetorician by training. I study rhetoric, and this idea of election month is a new phenomenon. We didn't used to have that phrase in the United States. And the Transition Integrity Project of 2020 argued literally that the concept of election night is a threat to democracy, right? That's just an unrealistic expectation. Well, it's an unrealistic expectation that worked just fine for over a century, right? That every modern election that we had until 2016, arguably, or certainly 2018, right? It worked right up until then. And precisely the moment, you're right, at precisely the moment that it became more feasible to get it done on election night because of technological advances, that was the moment that it became impossible to do. And I would argue that, in fact, the concept of election night is a means to facilitate and abet election fraud and manipulations, right? And since it's the absentee ballots, the mail-in ballots, those tend to advantage Democrats, then the longer that we can stretch overtime, the greater advantage they have. And that's what that is about. And so the American people have to insist and hold local officials accountable. No more broken water pipes, no more stopping counting at 4 a.m. when we don't like how the count's going, right? No more putting up cardboard so the American citizens can't see what's going on inside. We count until the election's counted. And once it's counted, it's done. And the American people have the right to expect that level of competence, from their leaders.
Absolutely. Adam, I really appreciate you coming on the program and your work with the Transition Integrity Project 2024. I'm going to have links up at the P.A.S. Report website. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you again, Nick. Always fun.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.